Under the cold light of a full moon, the abandoned amusement park loomed on the edge of town, shrouded in an unnatural stillness. The wind howled through the broken-down rides, rusted metal creaking like the groans of forgotten souls. Once a place of joy and laughter, the park now stood as a decaying monument to lost dreams, its entrance gates chained and padlocked, warning intruders to stay away. But the warnings were ignored by those who sought the thrill of the unknown, or perhaps were drawn in by something much darker. The legend of the park was well known among the locals. It had been shut down years ago after a series of gruesome accidents claimed the lives of several visitors. No one knew what had caused the accidents. Some said it was faulty equipment, others whispered of sabotage, but the park had been closed indefinitely, left to rot and crumble into the earth. That didn't stop thrill seekers and ghost hunters from venturing in after dark. They came with flashlights and cameras, hoping to capture proof of the supernatural. But most of them left without finding anything, or so they claimed. The few who had spoken out about their experiences were never the same afterwards. Their eyes hollow, their voices trembling. They spoke of shadows moving in the dark, of whispers that seemed to come from the very walls of the park. Tonight, a group of 4 friends had decided to test their courage. They had heard the stories, but like many before them, they were skeptical. They laughed as they slipped through a gap in the fence, their flashlights cutting through the thick, suffocating darkness. The park was a labyrinth of twisted metal and rotting wood, the remnants of once vibrant attractions standing like skeletal sentinels in the night. The carousel, its horses frozen mid-gallop, loomed in the distance, its once bright colors now faded and peeling. The Ferris wheel stood silent and still, its rusted frame casting eerie shadows on the ground below. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. The laughter died in their throats, replaced by an uneasy tension that none of them could shake. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the emptiness, each creak and crunch of gravel sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. They came to the old funhouse, its entrance a gaping maw of darkness. The facade, once painted with bright, cheery colors, was now a faded, cracked mess of peeling paint and broken glass. The door, hanging off its hinges, creaked as they pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the hollow structure. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. Their flashlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The mirrors, once pristine and polished, were now grimy and cracked, reflecting twisted, distorted versions of themselves back at them. The floor creaked ominously under their weight, each step a gamble against the rotting wood. One of them, a girl named Sarah, shivered as she caught sight of something in one of the mirrors, a figure, standing just behind them. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. The others laughed nervously, brushing it off as a trick of the light, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As they moved deeper into the funhouse, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with an unnamable dread. The mirrors seemed to close in around them, their reflections growing more twisted, more nightmarish with each step. Faces began to appear in the glass, faces that weren't their own, pale, gaunt, eyes hollow and staring. The whispers started then, low at first, just on the edge of hearing, but growing louder, more insistent with each passing moment. "Get out," they hissed. "Leave this place." But the group pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. The whispers grew into a cacophony, the voices overlapping, coming from all directions. The walls seemed to close in around them, the mirrors warping and twisting. The reflections no longer just distorted versions of themselves, but something else entirely, something hungry. Panic set in as they realized they were lost, the funhouse a labyrinth of twisting corridors and dead ends. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as the figures in the mirrors seemed to reach out, their hands pressing against the glass, leaving smears of something dark and wet. One of the boys, Mark, stumbled and fell, his flashlight skittering across the floor. He reached out to grab it, but his hand brushed against something cold and slick. He pulled back, his heart pounding in his chest, but when he looked, there was nothing there. Just the endless, distorted reflections staring back at him. Sarah screamed then, a high-pitched, terrified sound that echoed through the funhouse. The others turned to see her standing in front of a mirror, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. In the glass, a figure stood behind her, its face obscured by shadow, its hand resting on her shoulder. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. But when she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone, replaced by her own terrified reflection. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, the voices overlapping, blending into a dissonant, maddening chorus. Then, suddenly, the mirror shattered, sending shards of glass flying through the air. The lights flickered, plunging them into darkness. The whispers stopped, replaced by a silence so thick it was suffocating. They were alone in the dark, the air thick with the scent of blood and decay. And somewhere, in the depths of the funhouse, something was watching, waiting. The silence was deafening. The group stood frozen in the dark, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, the adrenaline coursing through their veins like ice. The shattered mirror at their feet was a jagged puzzle of broken glass, each piece reflecting distorted fragments of their fear-stricken faces. Mark's voice broke the silence, shaky and barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here." The others nodded, their courage from earlier evaporating into pure, primal fear. They huddled together, their flashlights flickering weakly, casting erratic beams of light that only deepened the shadows around them. The air was thick with tension, the scent of rust and rot clinging to their senses. They turned back the way they came, desperate to retrace their steps through the funhouse's twisting corridors. But the path they had taken seemed to have changed, the once familiar route now an endless maze of mirrors and narrow passages that led nowhere. The walls seemed to shift and pulse, closing in on them, the mirrors warping their reflections into grotesque parodies of their fear. The whispers began again, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the voices blending together into a malevolent chant that echoed through the funhouse. "Stay. Stay with us." Sarah clutched Mark's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This place, it's alive." No one disagreed. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on them, the air heavy with the weight of something ancient and malevolent. The funhouse had become a living, breathing entity, its walls pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to feed off their fear. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, the air around them turning frigid. Their breath fogged in front of them, the cold seeping into their bones. The mirrors on the walls began to frost over, a delicate latticework of ice spreading across the glass. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, the voices overlapping in a discordant symphony of madness. "Stay. Stay." The group stumbled forward, their movements frantic and uncoordinated as they tried to escape the tightening grip of the fun house. The corridors twisted and turned, leading them in circles, the mirrors reflecting their panic back at them in grotesque detail. Then, without warning, one of the mirrors at the end of the corridor shattered, the sound like a gunshot in the confined space. The shards of glass hung in the air for a moment before clattering to the ground, revealing a doorway hidden behind the mirror's surface. The group hesitated, the opening gaping before them like the mouth of some great, unseen beast. The air beyond the doorway was thick with a sickly sweet smell, like rotting flowers and decayed flesh. "We have to go through," Mark said, his voice hoarse with fear. "It's the only way out." They moved forward as one, stepping through the shattered mirror into the darkness beyond. The air was colder here, the scent of decay almost unbearable. The floor beneath them was uneven, the wood creaking ominously with each step. As they moved deeper into the darkness, the whispers began to fade, replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping that echoed through the space. It was the sound of something large and heavy, moving just out of sight. The walls seemed to close in around them, the ceiling lowering until they were forced to crouch, then crawl through the narrowing passage. They emerged into a large, open space, the source of the thumping now deafeningly loud. Their flashlights flickered, barely illuminating the room, but what little light they had revealed the true horror of their situation. The room was a vast, cavernous space, the walls lined with more mirrors, each one reflecting the same horrific scene from a different angle. In the center of the room stood a massive, twisted carousel, its once bright horses now rotted and decayed, their eyes hollow and lifeless. The carousel moved slowly, creaking as it turned, each revolution punctuated by the heavy, rhythmic thump of something unseen. But it wasn't the carousel that held their attention. It was the figures standing around it, motionless and silent. At first glance, they seemed to be mannequins, their bodies stiff and unmoving. But as the group's flashlights passed over them, they realized with growing horror that these were not mere mannequins. They were people, or rather, what was left of them. Their skin was pale and waxy, their eyes wide and unblinking, their mouths frozen in silent screams. They stood like statues, their bodies contorted into unnatural poses, as if frozen in the midst of some horrific dance. Some were missing limbs, others had their faces twisted into grotesque masks of agony. Their clothes were tattered and stained, the fabric hanging off their emaciated frames. Sarah stifled a scream, her hand clapping over her mouth as she backed away, her eyes wide with terror. The others were paralyzed, unable to look away from the horrific tableau before them. Then, slowly, the figures began to move. It started with a twitch, a slight jerk of a hand, or a turn of a head. Then, one by one, they began to step forward, their movements slow and mechanical, as if their bodies were being controlled by some unseen force. Their eyes locked onto the group, their expressions vacant and lifeless, but filled with a hunger that was all too real. The group backed away, their flashlights shaking as they tried to find an exit, any way out of this nightmare. But the mirrors that lined the walls reflected the advancing figures back at them, multiplying them, creating an endless army of the dead. The carousel continued its slow, creaking rotation, the thumping sound growing louder, more insistent, as if the very heart of the park was beating in time with their terror. Then the lights went out. Complete darkness enveloped them, the cold, clammy air pressing in from all sides. The last thing they heard before the darkness swallowed them whole was the sound of their own screams, echoing through the fun house, mingling with the whispers that never truly left. Stay. Stay with us. Forever. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating void that swallowed their screams, leaving only the echo of their terror hanging in the air. The group was plunged into a nightmarish abyss where time seemed to stretch and warp, every second dragging on like an eternity. Their flashlights were useless now, flickering weakly before sputtering out entirely, plunging them into a blackness so deep it felt like the air itself was pressing in on them. Panic set in as they groped blindly, trying to find each other, to find any way out of the oppressive darkness. Mark's voice cut through the silence, strained and desperate. We have to stick together. Don't let go. But the darkness had a will of its own, pulling them apart, separating them with a malevolent force that twisted their sense of direction. They stumbled through the inky blackness, their hearts pounding, their breaths ragged and shallow. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the sickly sweet rot clinging to their senses, suffocating them. Then, faintly at first, the sound of soft, rhythmic music began to play. It was a haunting melody, distorted and warped, like a lullaby played on a broken music box. The carousel was moving again, its eerie tune filling the air, echoing through the void. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as if calling them, luring them deeper into the darkness. Sarah felt something brush against her arm, a cold, clammy hand that sent a jolt of fear through her. She recoiled, spinning around, but there was nothing there, only the suffocating blackness. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she tried to steady herself, but the fear was overwhelming, a crushing weight that threatened to consume her. She stumbled forward, her hands outstretched, desperately searching for an exit, for anything that could lead her out of this nightmare. But the darkness was disorienting, twisting her sense of direction, making every step feel like she was sinking deeper into the abyss. Then, she saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance, barely visible through the oppressive blackness. It was weak and unsteady, like a candle flickering in a storm, but it was enough to give her hope. She moved towards it, her steps unsteady, her heart pounding in her chest. As she drew closer, the light grew stronger, revealing the outline of a figure standing in the darkness. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by shadow. He held a lantern in his hand, its weak flame casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. His eyes, though barely visible, seemed to glow with an unnatural light, piercing through the darkness. Sarah hesitated, a deep sense of dread settling over her as she approached. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, "please help me." The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering her request. Then, slowly, he extended his free hand towards her, beckoning her to come closer. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before she reached out, desperate for any kind of help, any way out of this nightmare. But as her hand touched his, a cold, clammy sensation spread through her body, like ice creeping through her veins. The man's grip tightened, his hand impossibly strong, holding her in place. His face slowly came into view as he stepped into the dim light of the lantern, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over his skull. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to suck in the light, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, rotting teeth. She tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding, pulling her closer. The surrounding darkness seemed to close in, the walls of the fun house shifting and warping, the mirrors reflecting her terrified face back at her from every angle. The whispers started again, louder this time, a cacophony of voices urging her to give in, to let go. "Stay. Stay with us." Sarah screamed, a desperate, primal sound that echoed through the fun house, but it was swallowed by the darkness, lost in the void. The man's grin widened, his teeth gleaming in the dim light as he leaned in closer, his breath cold against her skin. "You can't leave," he whispered, his voice a chilling rasp. "You belong to the park now." With a sudden, violent jerk, he pulled her into the darkness, the lantern's light flickering and then snuffing out completely. The world around her dissolved into a swirling vortex of shadows and whispers, the walls of the fun house closing in, consuming her whole. Back in the center of the park, the carousel continued to turn, its haunting melody echoing through the night, the sound of laughter and screams blending together in a twisted symphony of horror. The mirrors reflected the scene, 1,000 versions of the park's newest residents forever trapped in their own personal hell, their faces frozen in eternal terror. The park had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many before. And as the wind howled through the empty rides, carrying with it the faint, lingering echoes of their screams, the park settled back into its eerie silence, waiting patiently for the next group of curious souls to wander in, drawn by the irresistible lure of the unknown. But those who ventured into the abandoned amusement park would never leave. Not truly. Their bodies might be found, twisted and broken, their eyes wide with terror, but their souls would remain, forever trapped in the dark heart of the park, feeding its insatiable hunger. The park was alive, a twisted, malevolent entity that thrived on fear, and it would never be satisfied, always hungry for more. The legend of the park would continue to grow, whispered among those brave enough to listen. And though the warnings were clear, there would always be those who couldn't resist the call of the abandoned amusement park, drawn to it like moths to a flame. And the park would be waiting.